I'm Don Dickson, and I want to thank you for joining me for another edition of our master class. We're currently in discussion about the right stuff, fishing gear. How can we tell what gear we're supposed to be purchasing today in order to have success? In order to get to that point where we can discuss what I consider the most important equipment, what type of equipment you should be buying, I told a little story last time we got together. A story about how I met Buck Perry the very first day I met him. And I told that little story to make a point. And as I got a lot of feedback from that yesterday, I was curious, and I got the idea from all of the feedback. Everybody said, gee whiz, that was hilarious, and they enjoyed it, and so on and so forth. But I'm not sure everybody got the reason that I told that story. I'm not sure that I got my point across. So I want to mention it today, and then we'll move on. Back on that memorable morning in 1970, I was party to one of the biggest catches of fish that I have ever made before, of course, but during and since that time. It was one of the greatest catches I was ever involved with. And the reason I told the story is that the rudimentary equipment that was used by Buck Perry back in 1970 on that morning, in my eyes, was so ridiculous, so not what we were supposed to have. It made the catch that much more crazy. It made it that much more surprising. Here we were using stuff that most guys wouldn't have thought of using. But yet we caught one of the biggest stringers of fish that I've ever been involved with in a short period of time. We caught 55 of the biggest bass that morning that I had ever seen in my life. 3 fish over 10 pounds. I don't mean it was just a big catch of a good stringer of fish or double string. No, I'm talking they were hogs. And we were out in the middle of the lake in a 14-foot boat that I wouldn't have ever got in any other way than the happenstance that took place that morning, with a little 9.5 horsepower engine that nobody was using anymore. No serious bass fisherman wasn't using a 10-horse engine. The 4-foot trolling rod. The service saltwater trolling reel. All of these things that seem so out of place, so ridiculous, but yet the biggest catch that you could imagine of fish. So my point of that was to fortify what we had talked about for the preceding month. Depth and speed catches fish. There is no other way to say it. Depth and speed catches fish. It's not a rod. It's not a lure. It's not your boat, not your motor. It's none of those things. What catches fish is depth and speed. And Buck proved that to me in no uncertain terms. And I add one more little thing before we move on and actually start talking about the gear. I had a call when I started vlogging a few months back. I guess it's been over 4 months now. We started this vlogging. I had officially retired from earning a living at fishing about 15, 17 years ago. And I had over 500,000 students. And I used to get phone calls all the time. And of course, the longer I was removed from it, actively doing it, the fewer those calls got, and so on and so forth. But a lot of people stayed in touch with me and would call with questions and so on and so forth, which I was always happy to answer. But I got a phone call from a gentleman, I won't mention his name, but he was a student. He had been with me on water school at least twice that I know of, maybe more. Once on the water in Canada, once on the water in Florida. And I got a call from this guy, and he said to me, you know, a lot of the people in the neighborhood are excited about the fact that you're back talking about the truth in fishing. And everybody I know has been tuned into your vlogs and so forth, including myself. He said, but I thought I'd just sort of warn you. And this kind of made me smile. He said, I thought I'd warn you that in order for you to really be effective today, you would have to catch up on everything that you've missed over the last 15 years. And I said, like what? What have I missed? He said, oh, well, there's been so many changes in gear and the electronics and all of these major changes. And he said, it'd probably take you 4, 5, 6 months just to get up to speed on what you need to be talking about today. And I thanked him for his phone call before I hung up. But between you and me, I was a little bit upset with that whole attitude, but mainly was surprised for someone to think that after 2,000 years, the fish have changed. Somehow something's changed. So after I got that call from that gentleman, here was my take on that. Have I changed my fishing? Now mind you, I quit fishing for a living 15 years ago, but I didn't quit fishing. Have I changed anything? I can take you all the way back again to 1970 and let you know what I learned that day. That's what I've been doing ever since. I haven't changed a thing. Why would I? 55 are the biggest bass I'd ever seen in my life. Why would I change anything? I haven't changed nothing. I have not changed my approach. The only thing that's changed in Don Dickson over all of those years is experience. I probably have more experience than anybody next to Buck Perry that there ever has been. I mean, I'm fishing all the time for many, many, many years just to try to prove the point and carry on his legacy. I fished everywhere, all species. I have never changed one thing from what we did that day. Sure, I maybe caught my limit casting. I maybe was responsible for a big stringer through my mapping and interpretation, but it was everything that I learned from Buck. But my physical approach on a day out on that water, what am I going to do? I'm going to control my depth and speed till I run into the fish. And in order to do that, I need certain equipment, and that's the equipment I'm going to talk about today. So here we go. We're going to start talking about the tools today, and I want to start with rods. And as I just mentioned, we need to have two different types of equipment. That's one of the problems when you troll and cast both. The equipment that's used in trolling is not necessarily something we can use in casting, and vice versa. The proper tools for casting we can't use in trolling. So at a very minimum, as we begin looking at rods, we need two types. Again, I'm talking about the type of equipment we need. We need two types. We need a trolling rod, we need a casting rod. I want to start by mentioning that today manufacturers are not producing freshwater trolling rods. You never hear about one. You never see one, you never hear about one because they're not making them. So I'm going to tell you what a trolling rod should look like. Just like I learned back in 1970, and this has not changed. In order to do a good job trolling, which we consider to be absolute necessity in catching all species fish all year round, you have to be able to troll. In order to do that, you need the proper equipment. Now, as I mentioned, I think I mentioned it last week, a proper trolling rod should look something like this. Now, I'm not aggressively trying to bend this rod, I'm just flexing the rod. And you'll see coming all the way out here, follow my nose to about there, I have a lot of power and a lot of strength. But out here in this last section, I have a good tip. So it allows me to feel the lure, feel it working, and control my fishing on the troll. Now this rod should be 4.5 feet long, no longer. The longer a rod is in trolling, it becomes so difficult to fish during the course of a day, it just wears you out if you're trying to use a rod that's longer than 4.5 feet. But the shorter rod will allow you to do the job and fish all day almost effortlessly. So 4.5 foot, and it should look like this when you flex it. And this rod is made out of solid glass. It's strong, it's tough, it's durable. It's everything we want a trolling rod to be. That's it right there. Doesn't change, hasn't changed since 1950 when Buck made the first one, or 1945. When I came on board in 1970, this is what we were using. So you ask me, what am I still using? This. That's what I'm using. While I have this rod in my hands, I'm going to comment on two things. First, you might be looking at it and saying, it looks pink. It is pink. It's my wife's rod. Custom made by Buck's Baits for my wife. She likes pink, what can I say? So I thought I'd show her rod today. Any rate, we talked about the rod, solid glass, flex. I already showed you that's what it should look like. Good trolling rod. Now, in order to get to trolling, we need a service type reel. And again, I think I mentioned this last week, but in case I haven't, here we go. Penn is a saltwater reel company, but they made a reel that was to be used in freshwater, and they called it a 109 MF. And it allows, when you're letting line out, the reel handle turns backwards. It's direct drive, has a good star drag and anti-reverse, a lock on it, and it's just a service type reel. Back in the day, it was pretty inexpensive. But it was the type of reel that we like to have, because free spool reels like we used in casting, A, weren't necessary, and B, they tend to feed the line out too fast when you're letting line out under power to troll. So back in the day, Buck said, let's not get a free spool, let's go ahead and get one of these saltwater deals, and it'll work better for us. So that's what we used back in 1970, and that's what I'm using today. I have about 25 of these, and one of the bad things that I've run into since I got back in the game, I was informed by Penn they no longer make the 109 MF, which is this reel. They discontinued it. Here again is another idea of manufacturers building everything but what we need, because they're not basing their fishing on their knowledge of fishing. They're basing it on their knowledge of sales, what's selling. Well, these weren't selling very much. So right now, Buck's Baits, when I talked to Scott up at Buck's Baits, he says he's selling in conjunction with the trolling rods. He's selling a Penn 9. Now the difference between a 9 is it's not direct drive, it's a free spool. So if that's the only choice we have today, then that's what you're going to have to use. I did look just for fun, because my wife has clued me into something called eBay, which I knew nothing about. Just a very short time ago. However, I did find quite a few of these on eBay. So if you're acting quickly, maybe you can jump in there and get you a Penn 109 MF. That's a designation of this reel. And it would be preferred if you can find one. And if not, I would go with the Penn 9. Same idea, basically the same reel, except it is a free spool. Now, before I actually set this rod down, I want to talk about proper trolling line. And this is really, really, really important. It's just as important as everything else, but to me, it's really important. Because in my beginning fishing, when I went back to Pennsylvania after that day with Buck, I started my trolling with my regular monofilament line. Disaster. Most all line being built today is stretchy. It has stretch in it. Some has more stretch than others. Those lines are manufactured for casting. The softest lines go on spinning equipment, which is the main reason I never use spinning equipment. I'll mention it, but I never use it. And then the stiffer monofilament lines that I do use still have some stretch in it. You have to have stretch in order to make a cast. You can't make a cast if there's no stretch in the line. So I'll talk about that in a minute. But when it comes to trolling, having stretch in the line when you're under power with your boat, you're moving, and you're moving at pretty good speed most of the time. And if a fish hits and you have stretchy line, you have all of this stretch you have to get out before you can actually hook that fish. Not only that, when you have stretchy line and it's hitting the bottom or hanging up, it's just absolutely a mess. Buck figured years ago, I need to have a non-stretch type line, but there were none. Again, another example how manufacturers aren't manufacturing what we need. So what he did, he went to DuPont. DuPont strength. We went to DuPont and got together with their scientists and said, listen, this is what we need. Now back in that day, as buck was growing in popularity, it was a big enough deal for DuPont. They actually got together with Buck and built this no stretch line. Buck tagged it and called it no-bow. And this is what we use in trolling when we're trolling from 0 to 25 feet. In all of our trolling, 0 to 25 feet, we're using a non-stretch monofilament line called no-bow. By the way, now before I put this down, I want to mention to you, I always like keeping a full spool. Whether I'm working with no-bow or whether I'm working with my casting equipment, I always want to have my as full as I can get it. It makes all of your fishing easier. Don't be working with a half a spool or less than that. It just doesn't work right. Now, I picked up another trolling rod before I leave here because, as many of you already know, I've talked almost non-stop at how much of my fishing over the last 25 years has been deeper than 25 feet. Now with my traditional spoon plugs on the troll and my no-bow trolling line, I can only fish 25 feet. So we started, Buck and I both started at the same time testing different kinds of weighted lines to allow us to maybe get deeper. This is going way back now into the 70s. So we first looked at lead core. That was the first weighted line that came on the scene. It didn't work very good. I mean, you could get, it had some sinking qualities. You could fish deeper. But you had to let a lot of line out. You just didn't have really good control with it. And today, lead core is almost an antiquated type of equipment. I can't remember the last time I saw somebody who was using lead core line. Been too many improvements. Well, the next that we tested was braided wire. Now the braided wire spooled nicely and it had a good sinking quality, but it wasn't very tough. You were constantly breaking off, you were constantly having to replace braided wire. So we discarded that from our thinking, and Buck did a lot of research and he arrived at this solid steel Manel wire. And so we decided to have some spooled up and we started testing it and working with it. And man, it was terrific. It spools really well. It has a terrific sinking quality. Sinks great. And it's strong and it's tough. And it lasts. And I should say about braided wire too. Braided wire tended to get behind your spool in your reel and really create a mess. You ended up just cutting and cutting and cutting. But this stuff, it's perfect. It couldn't be any better. I can't imagine it being any better. Now, once again, I don't know anybody, any store, anywhere in this country where you could walk in and buy solid steel Manel wire, fishing wire. But again, Buck Spades, they have it. And I'm going to suggest to you, if you're not fishing deeper than 25 feet, all species, you're not being successful 100% of the time. I could promise you that. I think if I really had some sort of a stopwatch on it, I could say over the last 30 years, certainly over the last 20 years, I've caught the majority of my big fish deeper than 25 feet. Many of them deeper than 35 feet. Now, on the troll, if I didn't have wire line, I couldn't have caught those fish. I gave an example not long ago when we were talking about the saddle up in Winnipeg River where I had my summer schools. Literally thousands of big walleye, all caught on wire. Shallowest fish, 35 feet. Deepest fish, 60 feet. Without wire line, I couldn't have caught one of those fish. Now think about that. So is this an important tool today? Oh, yes. So before I set this down, let me just say that, again, just like my no-bow, I like to have a full spool. And the wire doesn't take up much space on your reel, so you need to back this wire line with some good backing. And of course, I use my no-bow trolling line for backing. But you want to end up with your spool being full when working with wire line. It just works better. Obviously, you're fishing deeper, you're dumping out longer lines and letting out and then picking back up again. It just is easier with a full spool. So make sure you fill that spool up. Now, if you want to sort of save and be frugal, you could have one trolling rod and two reels, one filled with wire, one filled with no bow. I just do the obvious thing. I get two trolling rods, one for my wire and one for my no bow. Now, I was in the business, so truth be known, I have about 35 or 40 trolling rods and reels. So I'm not going to get caught without. But as you're trying to re-equip yourself, maybe because what we're doing is a little bit different than you're used to, two reels, one with wire, one with no bow, you're ready to go fishing. Now, I'm talking to most of the fishing country. Obviously, if you live in Florida, you don't need wire line. If you're fishing for bass in Florida, we don't have those kind of depths. So use your head. If you're one of the northern or Midwest fishermen, the guys that are most of my clients are Midwest and upper Midwest, Pennsylvania, New York, upstate New York, Tennessee, in areas where there are reservoirs, there's deep water, where I wouldn't go fishing without at least no bow and wire. Just wouldn't do it. Okay, so now we're going to talk about casting equipment. I'm going to pick up some rods here. As you can see, I have a few rods sitting here. And I'll show you by the time I'm done, they're all pretty much the same. They're just different sizes. And I want you to keep in mind when I start this that I was in the fishing business. And I wanted to fine-tune everything that I did. And as Buck used to say, in casting equipment, you can get by with one rod. And I'll show you the one rod that he would recommend that you use if you just have one. Now, I know most of my fishing buddies have more than one casting rod. I have 5. They're all the same type. That's what I want to get across real quick. They're the same type. They're just different sizes. And I'll describe how I differentiate which one I'm going to use. And as I mentioned earlier, I don't use spinning equipment for the reasons that I gave. But in casting, I like bait casting equipment. And I like rods that sort of look almost, when I flex it, almost like my trolling rod. A lot of backbone coming out here, and here's where my flex starts. And to me, that's what a good casting rod looks like. Now, there's been a lot of improvements in rods. A lot of composite rods being built today. I mean, I've seen them all, know them all. Pretty much all of them. I'm still using some rods that I was using 20 years ago. And they're 96% graphite rods. But again, I don't care about the composite rod. I don't care about the newest and the latest and the greatest according to the manufacturer. I just care what works. And to me, what's important is the flex. And the flex in this rod, as is in all of my casting rods, is designated. If you go into a store, you'll see it designated as medium heavy. If you buy a medium heavy, designated rod, medium heavy, you're in the ballpark of where you need to be of a good casting rod. In the reels, there's low profile. I got some of them here. I've got this little Ambassador. I started using Ambassadors 40 years ago, and at least 35 years ago. And I still have a few of them. I still use them. Of course, I take care of my gear. I'm oiling and greasing and take care of my, and they work beautifully. Why would I go buy a new one? I wouldn't. And I don't really care. If you got the latest and the greatest, low profile, wide spool, which I like, by the way, fast retrieve, you know, strong gears and all of the above. If you have a favorite, go get it. I'm all for it. But when it comes to casting, I prefer bait casting reels. This is my first rod I picked up. I'm just going to show you why I have a few different ones. This rod is 5 foot 9 inches. 5.5 to 5'9" is a rod that I like to use in my topwater work. Occasionally when I'm working topwater baits or stick baits in the shallows, working it as a topwater bait. I like to have the maneuverability, and if I'm casting into little areas seasonally and so forth, I want to have a shorter rod. So this rod is a rod I use for topwater baits. Now, the next rod I'm going to pick up, once again, bait caster, but this rod is 6 foot. Now this rod I use when I'm fishing plastic worms. You'll see that the flex is a little bit different on this, but still again, this is designated as a medium heavy rod. But it's more suited to working my soft plastics. 6 foot, that's what I use. Still have it a bait casting reel, of course. The next rod that I'm going to pick up is 6.5 foot long. And this is the rod I use when I'm jigging, if I'm throwing deep jigs. And I know a lot of guys throw little jigs, rubber tails, they make some weedless baits, even if they're flipping and pitching in this grass and so forth, and they use jigs. But I'm talking about heavy jigs. I'm throwing to a deep 45-foot drop-off somewhere. When I'm doing that work, I use this rod. It's 6.5 feet long. I can shoot a heavy bait a mile with this. And if you look at the flex in my jigging rod, little more than my worm rod, but still medium heavy, strong, tough, coming all the way out to there, and then that flex right there. I hope you can see that in the camera. That's what a good casting rod looks like. Now, I'll put this down. I'll pick up this one. This is the one I use the most when it comes to casting. I'm using this rod for crankbaits. And most of you already know from our earlier talks, my crankbait is a spoon plug. I'm going to talk more about lures next time we get together. But in throwing the crankbaits, regardless of which one you're throwing, the whole idea is how far can I get it out there from a good casting position and get it down to where the fish are. When fishing deep structure with a crankbait, I need to be able to throw it as far as I can. I want my reel to have a full spool. I want it to be a wide spool. I want this rod to be 7 feet long. I know some of the bass and guys fishing in tournaments are using 7.5 footers now, for their cranking rod. But I find this 7 footer, I've had it with me for a long time. And as you see, it has sort of a two-handed handle on it. I can make the proper motion with a crankbait with this rod, and it throws the lure perfectly. I love this rod. I think I have 8 or 10 of them, exact. And I don't plan on getting anything else. But at any rate, let me show you the flex on my cranking rod. You're beginning to notice something? They're all pretty much the same. Same flex, medium heavy, same rods basically, just different sizes for different little jobs. But I'm talking now, I'm fine-tuning my stuff. And then lastly, I'm going to throw this one in. I don't use it much, but I have one. I just wanted you to know at least I have one. This is a flipping stick, and it's 7.5 feet. Now, obviously, this is a little stiffer. By nature, that's what this rod is for. And even so, I like to have some flex on my flipping stick. I don't like it to be a broom handle. But with the extra length, I can make my motion with very little effort. Keeping in mind, however, I don't use this very often. Because A, I don't like fishing, especially in my home state. I don't like fishing spawning fish. I know a lot of people do. They don't close the season down here. I wish they would, but they don't. But I don't do that fishing much. But there will come a time where I may have to have a stick like this to get the job done. So I have one. I just hardly ever use it, but I wanted to show you anyhow. So as we wrap up what we're talking about with casting rods, the idea is medium heavy puts you in the right ballpark, regardless of the maker of the rod. And a well-made casting reel today, bait casting reel. There's a bunch of them. There's some I really like. I could mention, but I won't because they're not paying me to. And I don't want to shortchange somebody else. But I like the low profile stuff. wide spools, and I want a high retrieve rate. I want a fast retrieve rate, especially when I'm cranking spoon plugs in the summer. I need something that brings that lure back. So those are things I look at in my bait cast and reel. All of the rods, pretty much, as you can see when I flex them, they're pretty much the same, even though I'm using different sizes. Now, Buck said years ago, if I could only have one casting rod, he said I would have a 6-foot rod to do all jobs. And it would be a medium heavy flex, medium heavy action. He said 6 foot. And I'll probably be doing a little talk on this coming up soon. But I believe today there are some areas in equipment where what Buck said literally 50 years ago can be changed a little bit without changing any of the real heavy duty stuff that really counts. I think we can change a few little things. And I would tell you today, if you can only afford one casting rod, I will get a 6.5 foot rod. Medium heavy action, 6.5 foot rod. If I could only have one, this would be it. But I know most of you have more than one casting rod. And probably going to have, you're probably going to get some additional casting rods. But that's what it should look like. And you could get by with one, but bare minimum now as we look at rods, reels, and line. Oh, I should mention, I didn't mention, I'm going to come back and mention. On my casting line with my bait casters, I like using the stiffer monofilaments. They all have stretch in them, but the real soft ones, the ones that are really built for the spinning outfits, I stay away from them. I want a little more stiffer monofilaments for my bait casting line. That being said, we've covered trolling rods, we've covered trolling reels, we've covered casting rods and casting reels, and we've covered the lines. Again, I'm not mentioning anything that is manufacturer based with the exception of the trolling stuff. You can only get it at one place, Buck's Baits. So I encourage you to do that. Until the next time we talk, be sure to like us on Facebook and subscribe to our YouTube channel. By the way, when I made that request the last time we talked, my subscribers have jumped a little bit, so I appreciate that. Appreciate all of you. And if you're liking these videos, do me a favor and subscribe today if you haven't, and we'll see you the next time.